to see their, great, thank you. I'll just wait until we have people come in, and then I'll continue, because otherwise you're going to have to edit.
Okay,
Okay,
I'll admit everyone.
thank you. Welcome, everyone. We got a big turnout tonight. I understand 130 people signed up, so that's pretty good. I'm glad everybody wants to hear about what's happening and how it applies to inner urban transect neighborhoods. Good to see everyone. We'll just wait a minute or two, let everybody in. I just want people to know that this is being taped. We do that because for those who missed the meeting. So if you do not want your image to be seen, please turn off your camera if that is a concern to you. Otherwise, we'll just continue. And we're going to try and we'll mostly use chat because it's a little more efficient. But if you if we may take questions as well verbally, but we'll just see how it goes. We want to try and get as many questions in as possible, and we'll try and go for efficiencies of getting people's questions answered. So, okay. I'm going to introduce Elizabeth, and she'll introduce the rest of the city team. I'm very happy that they're taking the time tonight to talk to us about what's happening and how the new provincial changes are affecting us and what's coming up with zoning. So lots to discuss. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I'd like to honor the land and the peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, whose ancestors have lived on this territory for millennia, and whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Il est important de souligner que la ville d'Ottawa est située sur un territoire non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe. J'aimerais honorer les terres et le peuple de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, dont les ancêtres ont vécu sur ce territoire durant des millénaires et dont la culture et la présence ont enrichi et continuent d'enrichir ces terres. Merci. Thank you very much. So I'll start off by introducing Elizabeth White, who's going to lead us, and we have some experts here. Hi, Elizabeth. I also have some team members from my office. We've got Barbara Greenberg, who's been working with me on planning files, and Marlene. Many of you are familiar with her if you've called to our office or had some casework. So she's here tonight, and I think Georgie's coming along too. So we've got a whole team here. So Elizabeth White is a strategic programs and project officer with the business and technical support for the city, and she'll introduce the rest of the team. And now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I'm just going to share our presentation as we get started here. Thank you all for joining us this evening to get an overview of how planning is connecting with Bay Ward. Thank you, Councillor, for taking care of the land acknowledgement. So I will move now to our Zoom protocol, and just highlighting that we have expected well over 100 people this evening, so we will have participants automatically muted as they enter the call. But to speak, you can either use the raise your hand function, and during the question and answer period, we can try and manage questions that way, or as Councillor noted, maybe we'll start with some written questions. You'll see in my name questions that are in the parentheses there, because I can start combining those into some themes, and we'll facilitate the question and answer period. But if you do want to speak, raise your hand and we will unmute your microphone for you. So I will pass it over. Tonight we'll be hearing from Royce Fu, who is the manager of policy planning here in the Planning, Real Estate and Economic Development Department. And we also have Allison Hamlin, who is the manager of Development Review West. So I think we'll let them take it away and start talking about first the official plan, then the new zoning bylaw, planning in Ward 7, and then we'll move to questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Is the presentation in presentation mode?
Sorry, I can see it in presentation mode, but you can't. Let's see.
Okay, no, I think that's, if it isn't, that's fine.
No, I think, yeah. Sorry. I'm not here. Anyways, you get started and I'll move it over.
Okay.
This is a new format for me. I usually have the whole hub.
Okay, so are you still, sorry, on my screen, I'm seeing the agenda. And there we go. Okay. Okay, new official plan. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So the before we get into the official plan, I just want to just give an overview of the framework of land use planning in Ontario. You can see in this screen here, we have official plan, the city's official plans in the middle, but before we get there, we have what we call the provincial policy statement, and that is the overarching policy document for all municipalities to plan in Ontario. And it's a policy document that gives direction on what planning has to encompass, what it has to cover in Ontario. And then after that, we have the Ontario Planning Act, which is a piece of legislation that provides further direction on what plans need to contain, but also how various development applications, sort of the rules of making an application and appeals and notice and so on and so forth, and also what zoning bylaws can and can't do. Then we get to the official plan, and you know, from the municipality's point of view, the official plan is a high-level document. If you're flying in a plane and looking down, that's sort of the level. There's not a lot of detail. It's high level. And then stemming from that, we have non-statutory master plans, which is things like the city would be the transportation master plan, the infrastructure master plan, and the green space master plan. And they relate to official plan by setting a plan to match the growth in the official plan. So for instance, the transportation master plan will look at all of the directions in the official plan, and it'll establish a sort of transportation network and some projects to get people around. On the other side of the screen there, we have what we call secondary planning. So this is a bit more detailed than the official plan. And these are things that we call secondary plans or community design plans and transit-oriented development. That's what TOD stands for. And they provide a bit more detail so that sort of at an area level. And then after official plan, we have the city's zoning bylaw, and that is much more detailed. It provides the regulations for land use and lot sizes and the size of buildings. And then after that, we get into implementation. So a lot of development happens through applications that are set out under the Planning Act, such as official plan amendments, zoning bylaw amendments, site plan control, and so on and so forth. Some of those applications go to council through standing committees. The biggest ones will be Planning and Housing Committee and Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee in the rural area. We also have applications that are delegated to staff through site plan control. And we also have Committee of Adjustments. They're an arm length committee that oversees legal non-conforming uses, consents to sever properties, and site development through a minor variance. Next slide, please. So within Ontario's planning framework, the official plan has to be consistent with the provincial policy statement. Okay, so if we get direction from council or there's some feedback that's contrary to the provincial policy statements, that would be sort of difficult for staff to implement. It also has to meet the Planning Act requirements. So our newest official plan was developed through the years 2019 to 2022. And it's just a policy document that guides how Ottawa will grow over time. And after it was adopted by council and approved by the province, we are now looking at implementing some of the master plans that go along with it, such as a transportation master plan and infrastructure master plan. Okay, next slide. So the city's official plan directs how the city will grow over time. And in terms of the growth, in terms of population, we're looking at a population of 1.4 million people by 2046, just under 600,000 households, and over 800,000 jobs. So to guide this growth, the official plan sets out 5 policy directions. We call it our 5 big moves. The first is for growth, is to achieve by the end of this planning period more growth by intensification than by greenfield development. For mobility, we want to have a higher share of transit ridership and other sustainable modes of travel in comparison to today's share and other North American mid-sized cities. We want to improve our sophistication in urban and community design. And we want to embed environmental, climate, and public health resiliency into the framework of our planning policies, and have a similar outlook of embedding economic development into the framework of our planning policies. So at the end of the day, we have a plan that balances all policy directions. Okay, next slide. So in terms of that growth, we'll just focus on housing for now. It's looking at a growth of just under 200,000 new private households and dwellings. Now in Ottawa, we have 4 sort of major geographical growth areas. We have the urban built-up area, which is the area that's already been developed. And we have the urban greenfield area, so it's within our urban boundary, but it hasn't yet been developed and for the most part has vacant lands or maybe farmed in the interim. Outside of the urban area, we have the rural area, and most of the rural growth will concentrate in our rural villages and sort of other enclaves within the rural area, mostly country lot subdivisions. Next slide. So in terms of the urban components, most of that growth, as per that direction, is to be through intensification. So within our built-up area, we're looking at about 92,000 new dwellings, of which 49,000 should be suitable to larger households, and that's really, households with 3 or more people. And then on the greenfield side, we're looking at about 90,000 new dwellings, and that's of which 80,000 would be suitable for larger households. And that's really, that's indicative of what we see in suburban subdivisions, mostly comprised of single detached and row house types of development. Now, most of the green fields on this map here, the colored areas outside of the urban area, those are the expansion areas, urban expansion areas that are added to the official plan. But there may, as you can see, like in Riverside South, there's areas of gray, and that's undeveloped portions of our existing urban areas. So although those areas combine for our greenfield urban area. Okay, next slide. So one of the new things in an official plan, or you can do one more click, is this notion of transects. And transects, we have 6 sort of rings around the city, and they correspond to periods of development. So we have the downtown core, which is in the central part of the city, and then followed by the inner urban area, the outer urban area, the green belts, our suburban communities, and then the rural area. And you can see here in Ward 7, it's comprised of 3 transects. By geography, a good chunk of it's going to be the green belts, and then we have outer urban in the west, and then inner urban to the east of the ward. Okay, next slide. And this is just an illustration of what these transects more or less look like. In the green belt, it's really predominantly natural areas with some agricultural uses. And as you drive into the outer urban area, you begin to see some of the lot patterns is more regular. The built form is more regular. It's predominantly low rise. And as you drive again through the ward into the east, you get into the inner urban area, and now the lot pattern is not as regular, and the built form is also a bit more diverse, and also tends to be a bit, in comparison to the outer urban area, a bit bigger. Next slide. So that's transects. The next big thing in our official plan are what we call designations. And we have many schedules, and that's a jargon for maps in our official plan. But we have 9 schedules that just show designations, and they correspond to the transects. I just have these 2 screenshots here of the inner urban transect in the outer urban transect. Now, designations are really meant to describe the function of an area, the function of an area in its role within the city. Land uses are part of its functions, and there's also a hierarchy of intensity that the designations kind of help sort out. So we have varying levels of density, height, and types of built form that are permitted within designations. Okay, next slide. This is Ward 7 here. This is a snip of the urban area to the right and the outer urban area to the left. And you can see that thick gray line that runs to the Ottawa River. If you can just imagine sort of snapping the two together, you now have sort of an image of the outer and urban transects and the designations in them within Ward 7. And next slide. Okay, hubs. So hubs are sort of, I don't have control of the mouse, but it's the purple areas that you can see on the screen here. Elizabeth, want to give the screen a click? Actually, you can go back one. If you can go back one. There we go. Okay, we'll leave it there. So some examples of hubs in Ward 7 are Bayshore Shopping Center to the west. Then we have Lincoln Fields and Carlingwood Mall, and the Pinecrest Queensview area. That's where Leon's is. Now, hubs have a diversity of uses. They're really meant to be the highest areas of our transit connectivity, and also our higher density of development. These areas tend to be have a high degree of vibrancy, and really they enable movements, from within the city, and then also from that area back out to other areas of the city. Okay, next slide. So corridors are the purple lines here, the thick and the thinner purple lines on the slide. And you just give the slide a click. And so some examples of corridors here are Carling in Richmond, and Bayshore is a minor corridor. And then again, within the inner urban area, we have Richmond and Carling, Woodruff as main streets, and Pinecrest, Queensview, Du Maurier, and Maitland as our minor corridors. So similar to hubs, these areas tend to also have a diversity of uses. If you can picture these streets, there will be a variety of commercial activities, some offices, some retail, some restaurants, but also some residential of different sizes as well. And these corridors are important because they provide our street transit service. And our building height maximums along these corridors are really dependent on the width of the corridor. So the wider the corridor, the higher the building permission can be. The official plan wants to provide access to the transportation services and the commercial services we see on these corridors by locating growth here, but also improving the connections so that folks can access them from the adjacent neighborhoods. And that really goes to trying to improve our 15-minute neighborhoods, which is the ability to walk to daily and weekly needs within 15 minutes. Okay, next slide. Okay, and the overlay, we have one overlay in this ward. It's called the Evolving Neighborhood Overlay, and that's sort of that stipple, that purple stipple throughout both of those maps. And if you want to give the slide a click. Great. So the overlay provides sort of direction that we would see some gradual evolution from the underlying designation. So over time, we would see more urban built forms than what that parent designation would permit. It's also meant to promote more of that missing middle housing. And when we say missing middle housing, if you think of traditionally where most of residential growth occurs, it's typically in sort of taller condominium apartments or lower rise single detached dwellings. In the built up area, we tend to get mostly condominium apartment buildings, but we don't, and we have a lot of existing single family detached, but we don't have a lot of that sort of built form that is in between those two, hence it's that missing middle. Now, this type of built form, again, it's meant to be generally low rise, so up to 4 stories. And it's important because it adds critical mass to support services within our hubs and on our corridors. And the other function that these overlay areas provide is a bit of a transition from the development that can occur in hubs and corridors and the adjacent neighborhoods. Okay, next slide. So neighborhoods, that is everywhere that's sort of white on the 2 maps here. And if you want to give the screen a click. Now, these are characterized as mostly low-rise residential. There will be a little bit of variety in the built forms, and the lot dimensions will be where you get your most variety. But depending on where they are, Ward 7, it's the inner urban area in the east of the ward will be at a different stage than what we see in the west part of the ward. The plan in these areas still tries to reinforce elements of 15-minute neighborhoods. We want to try and make connections to other plans so we can improve our connections to these commercial areas and where we have our service amenities, and maybe even maintenance, trying to change some of our maintenance, particularly winter maintenance, so that's a bit easier all year round. And the last thing I want to note about neighborhoods is with Bill 23, this is legislation introduced by the province in November 2022. Legally, dwellings, single detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and row houses are now able to permit 3 units within those structures. They can be a dwelling with a basement suite or even a coach house. And a coach house is sort of like, if you can think of a detached garage that's been converted to a small little house, that's what a coach house is. Or you could have 2 or 3 dwellings side by side, kind of like a small row house, or they can be sort of stacked on top of each other. You may never know that there's that many dwellings inside if it's sort of renovated from an existing single detached or semi-detached. But that is now legal through the Planning Act, and that's one of the jobs that we'll have to implement in our new zoning bylaw. Okay, next slide. And then finally, I just want to throw up our slide on heights by designation. So we talked about the hierarchy of development intensity by designations. We can see this sort of through heights. So in hubs, you can have low rise and mid rise development. You can even have high rise, and it's really looking at a wide range of heights from 3 stories up to 40 stories if it's compatible with the adjacent area. Main Street corridors are similar, 2 stories up to maximum of 40, depending on the context and the road width and the transition. Minor corridors are 2 to 6 stories. You see the red strikeouts on the screen. Council adopted minor corridors at 4 stories. In its approval of our official plan, the province changed minor corridor heights to 6 stories. And in neighborhoods, they're predominantly low rise, no minimum heights. Generally, we're looking at 3 stories, no more than 4 where it makes sense. Okay, next slide. All right, so in summary, official plan is a plan that achieves a balance of 5 policy directions for growth, mobility, design, resiliency, and economics. We have growth that we need to accommodate. Most of that would be within the urban area, of which more than half is intended to be through intensification. We have these context areas we call transects, and they provide context for the built form. Then we have designations that allocates a density, heights in the types of built forms. And then finally, we have an overlay that signals gradual evolution and helps with the transitions from hubs and corridors to adjacent neighborhoods. All right. So that's it for the official plan. We'll move on to the next slide. And now we're looking at the zoning bylaw. So a zoning bylaw is a legal document that regulates land use and the translation of the official plan, secondary plans, and community design plans into implementable on-the-ground results, such as like buildings. That's really one of the results that the zoning bylaw gives rise to. Next slide. So the new zoning bylaw. So we have an official plan, and our current bylaw, it was amalgamation of former municipalities after amalgamation in 2001. And now with a new official plan, we have to do a new zoning bylaw. We have 3 years to do it. When council approved the strategy for the new zoning bylaw, they directed that it should be efficient, effective, and equitable. Or in other words, a zoning bylaw that is clearly written and understood. It regulates development consistent with official plan and fosters a permissive regulatory environment that is fair, and diversity in housing choices. Okay, next slide. So, at a really high level, the zoning sets out rules for what is allowed on a lot in terms of density, the setbacks from a building wall to a lot line, the height of a building, its form, landscaping that would go around it, and even waste management and amenity spaces. So that gives rise to what it could look like on the outside. But in many instances, you might not know what's on the inside. You want to give the slide a click. So that same sort of large building that you see on the outside, it could have a variety of units on the inside, and you may not know it, right? So that one building could have any combination of one large unit all the way to 6 smaller units inside. Next slide. One of the other things the zoning bylaw looks at is sort of what we call functional requirements. There's a little bit of jargon, but it's kind of how a lot sort of functions for its intended use. So if we look at this sort of this snippet of a residential street, the zoning bylaw will regulate our rear yards, right? So from our rear wall to our rear lot line, talk about some landscape buffers. If you have a lane, provides waste collection, stormwater outlets, how you might store things on your property through a shed or a garage, amenity spaces. Of course, it provides that house box, which is really the form and height and the volume. It even speaks to the elements of climate resiliency. So if you had solar panels on your roof, or if you had a rooftop rainwater storage system. There's other planning jargon like articulation and fenestration, which is just fancy ways of talking about providing interesting lines and materials, and the use of windows, so that it's just not a blank wall with no interest from the street. Talks about front yard uses, driveways and landscaping, the yard setbacks, trees, and even required soft landscaping. So all of these things together with the built form of the house really talks about how a site functions. Okay, next slide. The next couple of slides will be a bit of a commercial of our new zoning bylaw. In total, we will have 3 drafts of the bylaw that will be submitted to council. With the first draft, we're aiming for the first quarter of next year. We want to have a good consultation process for each iteration that will help shape an equitable city. So in March, we released 7 discussion papers. So 2023 is really meant to be foundational discussions. A review, comment, and just sort of putting out some ideas through discussion papers. 2024 and 2025 will be more about listening and building. We will have further review and receive comments back on those 2 drafts. And then it'll culminate into a final draft at the end of 2025. Okay, next slide. So 7 discussion papers released last month. They speak to climate change, resiliency, and public health, equity, diversity, and inclusion, land use, neighborhood character, neighborhood zones, trees in the rural areas. So we're asking the public to give us some comments via some surveys on Engage Ottawa. The link is down below there. The surveys will remain open through the summer. And then in the fall, perhaps around September, we will produce what we call an As We Heard It report that summarizes comments from the public. We're also looking at having further opportunities for public consultation in June, with the release of 2 reports concerning the revised urban design guidelines for low-rise infill housing and neighborhood form and function report. Okay, and I think that's it. Next slide.
Thanks, Royce. So yeah, we'll move to some specifics around Bay Warden here. I'm just putting the link there for the zoning Engage Ottawa page in the chat. And now we'll move over to Allison, I believe.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Royce. So Royce's team works more on the policy side of things, and the team that I manage is a group of planners and engineers who are doing the review of development applications. So we work with the policy that's been developed for the city, like the official plan and the zoning bylaw, and we review proposals for development against that policy to make sure that it meets the city's guidelines, standards, whatnot. We don't look though at building permit applications. That's our building code services group. What we're looking at is development of a certain scale. So next slide, please. So I'll just give some general information about zoning bylaw amendments. Royce was talking about the process of writing an entire zoning bylaw, but any property owner can apply to the city to request changes to the zoning, should they wish to change the zoning in order to do a certain kind of development. So they can change the use of the land, request to change, I guess, the use of the land, the maximum number of units in a building, the minimum lot size or width, the distance between a lot line and a building, minimum landscape requirements, parking and loading, height, of course. It's the development review function reviews those requests for changes. And when we are reviewing a zoning bylaw amendment, we're looking at it to make sure that it meets the city's official plan, that more general guiding document, a secondary plan, which might be a more specific area-specific guiding document, as well as very high-level provincial policy, which is in the PPS or provincial policy statement. And we're also using guidelines such as urban design guidelines or transportation guidelines or sewer design guidelines, that sort of thing, to make sure that the construction meets the city's standards. Next slide, please. Another type of development application is an application for site plan control. So this is when the zoning is already in place, the zoning permits perhaps like a high-rise building, and the city is looking again at how the site is being developed to make sure it's safe and functional and it minimizes impacts to surrounding properties. And we look at the location of the buildings, what the buildings look like, landscaping, traffic and pedestrian access, drainage, servicing, stormwater management, parking lot design and layout, all the details of the proposed development. The city can approve these with conditions and may sometimes require the owner to enter into an agreement with the city to be registered on title. And we also take securities often through a letter of credit to hold the money for a certain amount of time to ensure that the requirements and the conditions are met through construction. Next slide, please. So just in this chart is a diagram showing the different ways that the zoning bylaw and site plan review process goes. So Zoning bylaw is about the change of use of land or the change of the zoning performance standards. Site plan is more about how the site is being developed. In terms of counselor engagement, we do give notice through a heads up email to the counselor in any registered community associations. And we also give notice of the decision to the counselor. In terms of community engagement, heads up to the registered community associations. Applications are posted online to what we call the development application search site, or for short, we call it DevApps. You can find all of the plans and studies that the city is reviewing at the same time on that site. That's where any online comments can be submitted. We also post on-site signs while the development is active, while it's under review. And for those who have commented, the notice of decision is circulated to them. Zoning bylaw amendments require a decision of city planning and housing committee and city council, and they require a statutory public meeting, which is the planning and housing committee. Site plan control applications are delegated to staff for their approval. In terms of appeals, there are appeal rights for anybody for a zoning bylaw amendment. There are no appeal rights to a site plan control application, except to the property owner, not to the community or members of the public. Okay, next slide, please. And just some other types of development applications that the city reviews are official plan amendments, plans of subdivision, plans of condominium, minor variances that go to the Committee of Adjustment, and consent to sever applications also go to the Committee of Adjustment. Next slide. So I mentioned before we have this development application search tool, and I just wanted to give you the link here to how to find more information if there's a development that's being proposed. So you can use this search engine to find active or fairly recently approved applications online and look at all of the studies and the plans that have been submitted with them. Only certain applications are available through this development application search tool: official plan amendment, zoning bylaw amendment, site plan control applications, plan of subdivision. Those ones are available through this application, through this website, sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's it for me, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to send it back to Elizabeth. She can tell you a little bit more about upcoming engagement opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Yes, so we do always have projects on the go. And so as we discussed, there's the opportunity to share or read the discussion papers regarding the zoning bylaw, and feedback is always welcome. There's also, we run like a regular planning primer. That's a series of public education kind of workshops on planning, and there's going to be an official plan elective for that series. So if you really want to deep dive into some of the aspects that Royce kind of gave an overview, you can come and get more details on those transects and other strategic directions. Recently, we did release part 1 of the transportation master plan. So you can check that out on Engage Ottawa as well. And we're continuing to work on the 2024 development charge bylaw review. So the website has been launched. And finally, there is a survey available currently on the redevelopment of Lansdowne Park. So what's often called now Lansdowne 2.0. That process has started with some public engagement. So many different engagement opportunities, and hopefully you can choose the ones that are of most interest to yourself. Of course, today we are focused on the topics that have been reviewed by Royce and Allison. I do have some questions already in the chat, so maybe we'll start with those and then we can move on. So I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen so we can sort of see each other a bit more. And I'm just gonna start off a bit of a clarification question around just how the committee of adjustment is comprised. Like, who sits on the committee of adjustment? Is it councillors or appointees? Not sure if Allison or Royce or Councillor Kavanagh, if you're I'll unmute staff here.
Yeah, I can take that one.
Thanks.
Is that good? Okay. Yeah, so every term of council, there are some positions that members of the public can take. They're almost voluntary. I think there's a very small stipend that's given to people, but they are members of the public who basically volunteer to sit on these committees, and the committee of adjustment is made up of citizens who are on that committee for the term of council.
Okay, thank you. This is kind of going back to one of the slides. I'll try and pull it up if it's helpful. But there was a question just around the difference between the dark purple with dots and the pink with dots. So maybe I can find
the map with well, Elizabeth is looking for that. So just that purple shading, that would designate a hub designation. And if it had sort of the stipple, that would be an overlay. So an overlay can be on top of a hub and a corridor and a neighborhood.
Is this the right slide?
Maybe maybe the next one.
My mouse is. There we go. Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at the one on the left there for the outer urban, we have Bayshore. So that Bayshore itself is a hub, so it's all purple. And then sort of just to the east of that, in the crutch of Carling and Richmond, is that sort of purple stipple that that's an overlay on a neighborhood designation. Now the stipple also applies, the overlay also applies to the hub as well, but it really doesn't give much more to that hub than what the hub would what that underlying designation would already provide.
Thank you, Royce. Let me just stop sharing my screen here. Next question. So how does the city plan to encourage mobility in Ottawa, particularly the walking, biking, and transit use part of mobility? You know, is there more than just build it and they will come approach in the OP or other tools? Because it's a challenge convincing people to leave their car behind. So, you know, what ideas have we got to reach those mobility goals?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and you know how we do that. It's multi-layered. So the official plan plays a role by trying to direct growth closest to where we already have existing services, right? So that's already one big win. If you're already living closer to it, you now have more opportunities and options if you want to try and have increase your mobility through other means other than automobile. Now, the other layers come in through the transportation master plan, for example, to identify other projects that would help improve.
We'll give him a moment here.
Yeah, he's frozen.
Let's
Okay.
see.
Well, while we wait for Royce to come back, I'll just say from this, like, on a site by site basis. This like through development applications, what we are looking for is like ensuring that a site is designed in a way that's convenient for people to walk, convenient for people to access transit, convenient for people to, use their bicycles, trying, for example, to have not just all the required bike parking, buried in the parking garage, but some at grade maybe, so that people can park quickly if they want to go into a store. And then if you want to store your bike, it's in a different location. That's the kind of granular stuff that we would look at through a site plan application.
And we're looking at the transportation master plan almost simultaneously while we're doing these other things. It's got to meld together, obviously. We need to plan our connectivity. Transit connectivity is obvious in Bay Ward with the stations being built right as we speak, but it's a few years away. But in the meantime, we're also working on the connectivity to those stations and throughout the ward by cycling and walking. So constantly looking at options, and we have some proposals in the transportation master plan for Bay Ward that will improve Bay Ward. It will keep growing. There's so much to do. That's the thing about being an older neighborhood. We're kind of redoing ourselves. We're kind of renovating ourselves, as it were. The new reality is people want a more walkable neighborhood. That wasn't the case years ago when they didn't even put sidewalks in their neighborhoods.
Thank you, everyone. So how much weight is placed on trees and required soft landscaping, given the number of minor variances that cut into the green elements of a site? And is this going to change in the zoning bylaw?
So the direct answer to that question is really depends on the circumstance. But yes, the new zoning bylaw is looking at how to incorporate trees and landscaping with all the other elements that we need. So that's something that we're going to have to look at closer together and maybe refine that through our drafts as we move through the bylaw over the next couple of years.
Thank you. So where Bill 23 and the zoning bylaw are inconsistent with one another, and there's an applicant that's in line with, let's say, the OP, but not the zoning bylaw, what happens?
So Bill 23 is in effect, and to the extent where a zoning bylaw contradicts any permissions for Bill 23, I'm assuming it may be the issue on 3 dwellings permitted within a single semi or row house. Bill 23 comes out on top.
Elizabeth, just to let you know, there's a couple of hands up as well.
Yes, I thought maybe we could go through the questions that were submitted during the presentation, and then we'd go around hands up, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Thank you. Great. So now we had a question around just, is there a web portal to search building permit submissions?
No, building permit submissions are not, there's no provincial legislation that requires them, to have, there's no need for consultation on those. What the city does instead is publish like monthly reports on the building permits that were issued.
Thank you. And is the most recent official plan with secondary plans online?
Yes, if you go to ottawa.ca, that what you see and you search under official plan, the new official plan is what's online.
The understanding that there's 2 secondary plans that are still in progress.
Right, so there are, so there's the official plan, and then because it's a lot more complicated than one plan can have, we have multiple volumes. So there's a volume 2A is a compendium of all of the secondary plans that are currently have been adopted by council. On top of that, we are also, for Ward 7 particularly, we are undergoing 2 secondary plan exercises as well.
Excellent. So just two more questions from the chat, and then we'll hop back to raised hands here. So there's just a question around how a two-lane road such as Richmond Road and other two-lane roads become a main corridor.
Yeah, so that's a question I'd take back to my transportation colleagues, but I think it's the main street corridors are typically the wider corridors, right? So something like if you think of Maryvale, baseline to Viewmont, for example, I mean, or even Carling, right? Much wider. The roads that are more narrow, those are designated minor corridor, and that's just to in part to give sort of distinguish the amount of the volume that goes through there, but also the experience is very different, right? Between when you're on a main street corridor versus a minor corridor. And then the built form would also be different between what would be on a minor corridor and a main street corridor.
I should say that a good chunk of Richmond Road in Bay Ward, the section in Bay Ward, is under construction, is right beside a construction site because it's right beside the stage 2 LRT. The destiny of it is it will be a complete street when it's completed. That is the plan. And that also applies for Pinecrest to Bayshore. That will be a complete street. It's in the plans. They just haven't started it yet, much to my frustration. But that is the goal, is to have complete streets. So that means separate cycle from pedestrian, and it's not going to go past 2 lanes of traffic.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question here about, appreciating that the parking spots are reduced to encourage transit use, but many people do have cars or electric cars in the future for regional travel, and they'll end up being parked on narrow streets, often with no sidewalks. So what are the means to deal with that challenge?
Let me take that. That's a constant concern. It's, it depends on the streets. You can change the parking regulations on a street with the consent of the individuals on the street. But generally speaking, it's probably not worth people to do that, to park on the streets, because they are taking risks. But that's a constant question that comes up. When people take a place that has no parking, and then they have a car, and they don't have any place to put it, that's a huge risk they're taking. And that has to be thought through. But if they're going to park on side streets, we can change, and it's a safety issue. We're talking about any safety issues. Yeah, we can re-regulate it so that the parking is reduced if that's necessary.
Thank you very much. So moving to folks with hands up here, I'm going to ask William Pascal to ask your question, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
My question, I've read your plan, and there's a part of it that leaves me a little cold. And it's all around neighborhoods. Well, I support the 15 minutes and I support the intensification. That part makes good sense to me. What I don't see in the plan, and I've read your other documents, I don't see it either, is what are your principles that are guiding you in how we evolve? And I'm using the term from your plan that you're evolving, we have evolving neighborhoods, etc. I mean, neighborhoods are organic. That's how they grow. That's how they've grown. What I worry about is that through the planning, through the zoning, we start to shape neighborhoods, and we might be shaping neighborhoods in a way that actually works against them evolving in a way that's positive for the people that currently are living there and the people that will eventually live there. So I noticed you had in your 7 discussion papers a document around neighborhoods, and that may cover what I'm interested in. But really what I want to know is, what are your principles that are guiding how we start to shape, through the zoning and other things, how we start to shape an environment that's going to encourage what I would call positive neighborhood growth, which means, we allow people to get together, we're creating the right spaces for people to get out and see each other, et cetera. And let me give you one example. We have in this zone or this ward, we have areas that are high dense or are more low, low level development houses and all that stuff. Except now you have corridors that are going to allow 40-story buildings to go up. Now, part of my background is urban planning, so I have a hard time saying you're going to dump a 40-story building into a low-rise neighborhood, which then how is that going to create what I call the positive environment for neighborhood growth? I mean, in principle, I think where you're going makes sense, but if someone could explain that to me or point me to a document where you actually have mapped out those principles, I'd love to read it.
Yeah, that's great. So I would say, please go to discussion papers because we do outline the starting points of the discussion for what we would be looking at defining neighborhood character and the zones. And that's really talking about the building's height, their size, the floor area, the bulk, massing, their design of the building, the treatment for parking and driveways and landscaping. So these are neighborhoods though, right? So what occurs in a neighborhood is different from what occurs in a corridor. So I understand that, from a mental map perspective, when we use the word neighborhood, it's all encompassing, which includes the corridors and maybe the hub, maybe a shopping center, which is fine. Within our official plan, though, we do distinguish between what is a neighborhood and what is a corridor. So the 40-story building, and that's not allowed like everyone on a corridor. Just to be clear, it's also up to, depending on the circumstance, that would not be in the neighborhood area, the residential area. So the neighborhood character discussion paper is really about the neighborhoods themselves where we have residential zoning today. So I'd encourage you to look at the discussion paper for the neighborhood character. There's a one-pager if you just need a quick flyby, but there's a more in-depth discussion paper as well. Fill out the survey. That will help us guide the discussion and figure out what are the components that people are looking at. But we will pick up on that.
Gary's frozen again.
They're frozen.
Royce, we might ask you to turn off your video so that it might strengthen your signal.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think so. What we'll do, maybe, William, did you get kind of what you were looking for there? We can maybe go to Susan Glass, who's next, and then come back to you, William, if there's any follow-ups.
I'm happy. I mean, I'll read the paper
Okay.
on the neighborhoods, but it's just something I'm interested in how, and this all comes to, if we're going to evolve our neighborhoods, what are we going to use the guidelines to help do that? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Susan, sorry, here we go. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Good, thank you. Thank you for the discussion. A very quick note about the last conversation about tall buildings being on corridors, not in neighborhoods. We have a neighborhood that backs on a corridor, because they meet in the backyard. So even though it's on a corridor, it still affects the neighborhood. Just thought I'd say. But I have a question. I was at a meeting with a developer who was talking about getting an official plan amendment. And I noticed that term on one of your slides. And I wondered what kind of situation presents itself that a developer would be granted an official plan amendment.
Yeah, okay, I can take that one, and Royce can add if needed. But we're doing our planning under provincial rules, and the provincial rules allow for anybody who wants to do something on a property to make a request to the city. So we can't control that. Anybody who wants to can make a request. So a developer can buy a piece of property and say, I want to do, something on it that the current zoning doesn't allow, and maybe even the current official plan doesn't allow, and make that request to the city, and then the city evaluates it. And in the case of a zoning bylaw amendment, we're going up to the next level of policy, which is the official plan. And in the case of an official plan amendment, we're going up to the provincial level of policy, which is the provincial policy statement, which is a very general set of guidelines or directions about how development should occur.
So could that be about anything, or is it tend to be about height, or about like what's the context of an official plan amendment? I just can't quite visualize it as a on the ground citizen, what a person would be asking for in that amendment.
Let's see if we can you bring up maybe the section on transects, Elizabeth? So or even designations. So one thing that's in our official plan, our new official plan, is that certain designations, one of them being neighborhood, like just think of when we say neighborhood, we mean that as the designation in the official plan. Another one being hub, another one being corridor. They have height limits associated with them. And if somebody wanted to go higher than what's allowed in those categories, they could apply for an official plan amendment. The height limit right now in the neighborhoods, which in these slides is actually shown in white. The height limit there is 4 stories. So if somebody wanted to do a higher building, that would need an official plan amendment in the area that's shown in white here.
I see. And who grants that official plan amendment? Is that staff that grants it, or is it council that grants it?
It's a decision of council. Staff would be involved in the review and would write a recommendation report, but the decision is made by all of the members of City Council.
You can take a look at a typical planning committee, it's now called Planning and Housing Committee agenda, and it's full of them. And each one of them has a report written by staff giving a recommendation. It wouldn't be coming to us unless it was staff said, we approve this, we think this is okay, and this is why. And it also gives the back and forth of what community thought of it, etc. And it has even a spot where the councillor can make a comment. So that's how it works. You can check out any agenda. There's one coming up, and see, and that'll give you a cross section. Height is usually the biggest category, wanting height, but less and less so because of the provisions now that have been granted there. It's also, proximity to the side and front yards and that stuff. But yeah, different things.
Okay, I see. Could I ask another question, or I can wait my turn to come around if you'd allow?
I'll go for it, Susan.
Okay, thank you. I was at another meeting with a developer, and this was on Richmond Road, 1047 Richmond Road. But just, it interests me, Royce, that you were talking about width of street determining height of building, because they were considering, how there's Richmond Road and then a green space and then Byron, the linear park, and then Byron. The developer was taking the width of Richmond Road as the whole thing, from Richmond across the green space, across to Byron, and saying, well, the street is this wide, and this is why I can have a building this tall. But someone used the word experience. The experience of being Richmond as a pedestrian on Richmond Road is very different than walking on Merivale Road that is actually that wide. So I was just surprised that the developer could just decide to call all of that one street. And I wonder if anyone could comment on that.
Well, first of all, the city came to the city staff came to planning committee with a report refusing the applicant. Okay, which is rare.
I remember that. And was it partly based on the width of Richmond Road, or there were
Well,
many?
you've got- I would suggest you read the whole report, but it was based on, the overall was that was based on the fact that there's a secondary plan that was completed for that area and it ignored it. Where it said that in the secondary plan, it capped the stories at 20. And of course, it was way more than that. So that's the crux of it, is that it's in an area that already had a secondary plan that was approved by the community, by the city, and it did not follow it at all. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks, Susan. So just a couple questions that came in through the chat recently. So one is just how the city is planning to address some of the kind of more social dimensions of increased density. So they used an example. So right now, let's say there's a sign around a bus station or bus stop that says you can't smoke within 10 meters of this bus stop. And then with people living very much close together, they feel like, well, my neighbor who lives very close to me will probably be able to smoke right near my window. And so how do we kind of address those types of kind of sensitive neighbor kind of situations? And is that something that gets looked at?
So I'll take a quick stab at it. So my apologies for my internet. I think I've cut out a few times tonight. Actually had Rogers over today. They replaced the entire cable, but I guess it wasn't enough. So a lot of the things that the planning department looks at would be focused on sort of the land use issues. Sort of the other components is not typically part of our planning mandate, but what we try to do at the end of the day is create an environment where it would alleviate sort of other stresses, like so if the biggest example would be during the pandemic. There weren't enough, some stores didn't have enough supplies in hand or whatever, right? So if you were to provide more access to a greater number of stores, you might be able to have more options available to you. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is create an environment to do that. But that takes a long time, right? So that's one of the things that we're doing as a stepping stone today, so that the next generation, we're hoping, could be more resilient to those types of changes.
Thank you. Just a question around what's going to happen to the remainder of the old Lincoln Field Shopping Center. Is it going to be any dwellings there? Or is there going to be a minor road system installed?
So we are going through that process right now. I kind of came in my role sort of halfway through that, so I'm not up to speed on how much consultation we've done with the public. We are certainly looking at a residential development on the site, but it wouldn't be solely residential. So I would say stay tuned to any information that comes out from the city or even the councillor's office for opportunities to participate in that process.
Yes, we're working very closely with the developer and with city staff on the secondary plan. But the general intention for that lot is a whole bunch of high rises and a park. It would be on their property, but it would be green space for all use. So those are general plans that they're looking at. And we're working with city staff, and that's active transportation staff, to have a bicycle path going north-south through it, as well as one connecting more to the transit station. So those are in progress, and they're not ready to show us the whole plan because it's still in progress, and with the delay on the second stage 2 LRT, they're not in a hurry to build until that station's there. So that's been the general trend. If the station's not there, they're not going to build a whole bunch of high rises that aren't with very little parking till that station is complete. So it'll start moving a little faster in a year or two.
Thank you, Councillor. We've got a question here. With the increased density on Carling and Richmond, is there a plan for more community centers and parks?
That's an excellent question.
So that's one of the other non-statutory master plans we have that is a companion to the official plan is the Parks and Recreation Facilities Master Plan as well. And that was adopted at the same time as the official plan. So that gives an indication to some of the future spaces that the city is looking at for those areas, but it's it really depends on the nature of the development in terms of what the city would be able to provide for either parkland or community center space. So it's really context sensitive, but the overarching sort of principles come from the Parks and Recreation Facilities Master Plan.
Thank you. Do the current secondary plans continue with the new legislation and the new official plan?
Sorry, could you repeat the
Yes.
question again?
Yeah, no problem. So do the current secondary plans continue into the new official plan and any new legislation?
Okay, right. So the new legislation hasn't really affected the secondary plans. Under the old plan, we had a system of secondary plans and community design plans. And one of the things we did through the review is we looked at both secondary plans and community design plans. The difference is community design plans are not statutory. There's no accompanying official plan amendments. They're sort of just this almost a guideline for development. Whereas a secondary plan, it does have sort of that statutory power and through the official plan. Those are the primary differences. But we looked at both, and where the new official plan already provided policy direction that was very similar to what the community design plans or secondary plans were provided. The secondary plans or community design plans were sort of were removed, so to say, and same with the secondary plans, and we kept those components that were unique enough from what the official plan kind of provided. So under the new official plan, I talked about earlier that volume 2A of urban secondary plans, that has carried forward all of the former secondary plans that needed to be carried forward. Otherwise, the official plan provides much of the direction in those secondary plans.
I can tell you just as the counselor that both the Lincoln Fields secondary plan and the Pinecrest Queensview secondary plan are chugging along, and we're hoping to have public meetings. The dates haven't been set yet, but it should be before the summer, hopefully, on particularly on Lincoln Field. It's a little further along. So yeah, can't wait to get to that point and have a public meeting.
Just wanted to check, Sybil. Yeah, I think you're raising your hand. Here, I'll just ask you to unmute there. There should be a unmute option showing up. There we go.
Okay, thank you. I live in a community that is largely R1. We thought that we would be having a zoning study done of our neighborhood now. This is before the official plan. We're in the Transit area. We're near definitely near the new LRT, and we don't really at this point know what's happening if we're still going to have the opportunity to take part in a zoning study, or are we just now destined by the zoning that came down on the official plan, official city plan. You talk about 4 stories. We hadn't been hearing that we were going to get 4 stories. We heard mumblings about 3 stories, triplexes and the like. So do we get any input in this anymore, or is our neighborhood just part of the city now with nothing else?
And I should, and
I
you're
don't
talking about all of, oh, sorry, you're talking about all of McKellar Park, correct?
That's correct.
So the official plan has been adopted, but we are going through that zoning bylaw review right now. So now is a great time to go on to Engage Ottawa, go into the chat, click on the link that Elizabeth put in there. And
Okay, so
that is how, you can help provide some of the comments for the zoning in the neighborhood. Now, I said
Okay,
up to
so
4
the
stories.
answer,
and-
what you're saying to me is that McKellar is not going to have a planner come around and talk to us. We have to now take the initiative to read your report and put the comments in ourselves. Is that correct?
So in this stage of the public consultation, it is a review of the principles that are putting forward for the neighborhood character study. It's not a 1-year thing. There'll be public consultation throughout the 3 years. If that is something, if having a more focused group or a more focused discussion with the zoning team is desired, we can certainly look at that. But right now, we're just looking at year 1 of a 3-year public process. That includes reviewing some of the materials that we are offering for discussion. Provide us some feedback, and then we can report back what we've heard from the general public. And then we can sort of take a first crack at our first draft of the zoning bylaw, and then continue those discussions with the communities.
This is kind of a kickoff, Sybil. That's why I'm having this tonight. It's to get people familiar where we are right now and what's happened, so that people are aware of how the province's changes to our official plan fit in, and what the next steps are.
Thank you. Yes, and there will be, I imagine, quite a multifaceted, different types of engagement moving forward on the zoning bylaw, similar to how the new official plan had different types of engagement.
I guess what I don't understand is why Westboro could have months with a planner to make the decision of what their community would look like. And now it appears that our community, because it's now under the new city official plan, it's just, we're interurban with a Transex, so that we will have 4-story buildings and whatever. That's what I see happening tonight. I don't see that McKellar has not sure if I got the right wording, but we're now being treated we aren't even being treated as a neighborhood, we're just part of a community, a big community, the city of Ottawa community. Anyway, that I'll have to talk to my people and see what they think. Thank you.
I'll have to look into what happened in Westboro, since it's part of just Leaper's ward, and now of course, McKellar Park has now been moved into Bay Ward. So I don't know I think that they had a secondary plan is what happened. And it's usually related because of the stations. I don't know what happened with the Kitchissippi station, but we can look into it. But that was completed, just like one at New Orchard was completed already. And yet we still have some others that are still in happening. But so no, there's no secondary plan for McKellar Park. But it doesn't mean we can't look at the characters of the neighborhood as has been talked about. I plan to work with your community very closely, Sybil. I don't think it's going to be forgotten.
All right, thank you.
I just wanted to take a moment also to point out that there are times when the province has given some direction that the city just cannot opt out of. And in this case, I'm referring to a recent, the recent Bill 23, which now allows 2 units, 2 additional, like up to 3 units in a house, and that includes a townhouse. So that's the direction the province has given. I just wanted to be clear, like that's not something that individual communities will be able to opt out of.
Okay, yeah, good point. I've got a few more questions in from the chat here. Let's see. So it seems like the major corridor buffer for Richmond Road in the OP schedules is based on Richmond and Byron combined. Can anyone clarify about that?
Well,
I think it's just Richmond. I'm looking at it. Looking at the schedule right now, and it's Richmond, and the overlay is around Richmond.
Okay, good. Clarifies. So are there any plans to increase the role of neighborhood residents in particularly the early stages of planning decisions, given that, you know, they have firsthand knowledge of the neighborhood?
So one of the changes the province has made through another bill called Bill 109 has to do with the timelines for certain planning applications. If decisions aren't received within certain timelines, then applicants are entitled to a refund from their application fees. So one thing the city's been looking at is changing our process so that we can render a decision in time for these applications. And that means changing some of the consultation to be more upfront. So we're still working on that right now. But because of the changes with Bill 109 and the timeframes with applications, it's putting a squeeze on how much time we have to get these applications with a decision.
Thank you. We don't have anyone from the Transportation Master Plan here, but there's a question around whether it will allow for separated bike lanes as well as bus lanes on Carling Avenue.
We'd have to take that one away, I think.
At this point, no, not completely, but I'm pushing for it. The rapid bus lane is set to allow cyclists to use it as well, which is not satisfactory to cyclists. So it obviously takes a little bit more redoing to get cycle lanes there. I mean, the good chunk of the eastern part of Carling has cycle lanes down towards the experimental farm and heading right to Glebe. They exist. So it would be great to get them for the western part, and even the far west has a substantial shoulder. So it's that missing chunk, which is the busiest, and I think it would be great to have. And so yeah, so not yet, but I think it helps to put that down in the Transportation Master Plan and push for those things. The more voices, the better.
Thank you. So is sunlight reduction taken into account when taller housing is allowed within an existing neighborhood?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So we do require sun shadow studies to be submitted with an application when somebody is requesting like a rezoning. I guess it's not looked at if somebody is already meeting their, you know, the building envelope that they're entitled to in their zone. So if you're entitled to build a house that's 11 meters high and you build that, you know, there would be shadow. If, however, there's a site, maybe along a corridor where somebody wants to go higher than the existing zoning allows, then through a development application review, we would be looking at the impacts of the shadow. What we see is that narrower buildings will cast less shadow than a bulky building. So many of the newer buildings that you see being constructed compared to, high-rise buildings in the 1970s are taller and narrower rather than shorter and chunkier, because that shadow then moves faster. It will go, it'll fall to the west, basically in the morning. It will fall to the east in the evening, but it will not leave a property in shadow the entire day the way that a chunky building might. So yes, that is looked at, but it doesn't mean that there would be no shadow. We look in particular at low-rise housing, impacts to shadow to low-rise housing, impacts to shadow to parks, impacts to shadows to schools and other public spaces.
Thanks, Allison. There's just a clarification question that there's a Lincoln Field secondary plan online. Is this being revised in relation to the development that was being referred to, or any updates on that?
Sorry, on Lincoln Field?
Mm-hmm. So
Um,
does that development that we're discussing impact the secondary plan, or does that still stand?
Yeah. What's happening on Lincoln Field is it's a whole area. The Lincoln Field secondary plan includes the site of Lincoln Field. The station is called Lincoln Field, and it's kind of a big circle, so it takes in like a big a piece of Queensway Terrace North and Richmond Road, and a bit of Wood Park. So it's the whole thing. And it's in progress. I mean, we're still working on it.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we've just got one last question here, just a bit of a clarification regarding renewal of Richmond Road by Pinecrest. I just want to clarify, was it discussed that these are going to be full, complete streets with proper bike lanes?
Yeah, they'll have separate bike facility. We've had a couple of meetings on it, and the funding hasn't. I think it's going to be 2024 now, it's delayed, but that is the intention. We do have information on it on my website through my newsletter of the meetings we had and with illustrations. So so that's where it is. So it's in the works. And as soon as I get more information, I'll certainly post it because I'm very anxious to have it. It's well overdue.
Well, I appreciate they've got a lot of questions, this evening covered, and there's still now more coming in, and I think some hands waving as well, but I think this was scheduled to be 8 o'clock as a wrap-up time. So I think we might have to take any additional questions directly offline. You can email any questions that weren't completed today. I'll put my email address in the chat so I can help make sure questions get answered. Or you can certainly, there's many different, if you're about some of the projects we've been discussing, like the zoning bylaw, there's the engage pages where you can do so directly. I'll just put my email address in here in case there's any outstanding questions, and I'll work to get those resolved. Councillor, would you have any final comments?
Just an update on 1047 Richmond Road. It is before the land tribunal, and it's going to be before it in October. So it's going to be ways off. Guess they're pretty backed up. So so that's the Ontario Land Tribunal. That is where you appeal to if the city turns down an application. So just so you're up to date on that. No, thanks to everybody for submitting their questions. I know there was some questions submitted ahead of time, and my understanding is because there were some that were more specific than the general nature of this meeting to give overall information. They will be answered, and we'll, as Elizabeth said, we'll continue to take questions as always, and pass them on to this team, who I thank profusely for coming out and sharing this information, and thank everyone for taking their time this evening. We had an excellent turnout. It helps us all. There's so much to learn. There's a lot of changes. Some of them were thrust upon us from the province, so that changed things even more. So it's like no contest. We must, follow what they have put upon us, such as having 3 units on a piece of property, changing what we put for corridors from 4 stories to 6 stories, things like that, plus much more they have. But in terms of the individual neighborhoods, as Royce was saying, this is going to take 3 years, and there'll be time for input. And so there's opportunity here. We have great neighborhoods. We want to keep them great. We want to keep them green. We want to keep looking at even possibly expanding green space to match up with those high rises, et cetera. It's very precious. And it's very important to balance out. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate all your input, and have a great rest of the evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.